Great, thanks very much, Brian. And great to be here again. And yeah, I can't believe we're on week 5. They have flown in, and I hope you've all kind of found them useful. And if you haven't managed to catch previous ones, there are recordings available as well. But yeah, as Brian said, tonight we're going to be looking at processing the data that you gather from your local place plan process. Next slide, thanks, Paul. But yeah, in terms of who we are as a team, so yeah, I'm Chiara and I'm a director at Imagineif.space along with my colleague Ellie. And Paul will introduce himself shortly and his practice Place at the Table. Next slide, thanks, Paul. And who are Imagineif? So we are we cover things like local place plan consultancy, community engagement, things like brief development, co-housing briefing, CPDs, workshops, generally anything that we can do to help communities out in terms of bringing their kind of visions to reality, really. So we operate as a social enterprise. And I'll pass over to Paul to introduce Place at the Table and himself.
And so Chiara is an architect by training, and Ellie is an urban designer, but my background is as a planner. So Place at the Table, that's my practice. We specialize in community action plans and local place plans, project management, facilitation policy, writing draft plans, coding data, training, mentoring, and mediation. You can get in touch with either me or Chiara if you're interested in those services.
And so, as I say, we are on week 5 of the training session. So we've covered quite a lot of ground in terms of like the overall journey of a local place plan and what it takes at different stages. But in terms of tonight, we're really going to be focusing on that kind of processing the data side of things. And also we've got a final session next week, which is on writing your statement and of regard to statutory plans. And really that's going to be an introduction to the National Planning Framework 4. So trying to decipher what all of that means. So please do kind of tune in for that if that's of interest as well. But yeah, I think we'll get stuck into tonight's kind of topics. So next slide, thanks, Paul. But before we kind of zoom in too far, it's good to just think about where this piece sits in the overall kind of 6-step journey of your local place plan. So in previous weeks, we have covered, for example, in the project management session, we covered stages 1, 4, and to 6. Last week we looked at stage 2, which was really around the sort of engagement side of things, and this week we're thinking really focused around stage 3, which is the analysis section. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So again, thinking about questions that you might have to begin with. So things that we've heard are quite common questions are, what software do we recommend? What's the best framework to kind of theme your data? But also how do I work with data gathered from different sources as well? So there's what we're trying to do tonight is answer some of those questions, and inevitably you'll have more. So please do kind of put your questions in the chat as we go. And also just to say, look, we're kind of sharing tips from our own practice. So please kind of take what works for you, but also feel free to change what doesn't, because everyone's kind of coming at it from slightly different situations and contexts. But hopefully you'll leave tonight with a few hints and tips. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So some core principles we wanted to share around kind of data analysis. And these are kind of 3 things that we kind of firmly believe that if you're doing these 3 things, then you're going to be doing data processing fairly well. So things around, firstly, consistency is absolutely key. Secondly, honesty is also very important. And thirdly, transparency. And that kind of comes back to this point of kind of accountability as you as a kind of steering group for the local place plan, and so that you can be confident that if someone bumped into you in the street, you can actually explain the process that you went through in terms of what you've gathered and how you've kind of pulled that together in a kind of thematically grouped way. And there's many different methods and tools that you can use to code or thematize the data. But whatever approach you take, if you do the above, you can't go too far wrong. These are really 3 really important principles that I think Paul and I, if you could take anything away from tonight's session, those 3 things will get you off to a really good start. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So this is a bit of an overview of the process that we're going to kind of take you through tonight around analysing data. So we've tried to break it down into kind of 3 steps. So the first step being collating the data. The second step being kind of themed-based sorting and arranging of the data. And then thirdly, representing the data. And then just to kind of talk through in a bit more detail what those kind of stages are going to include. So if we zoom back to kind of step one, which is collating the data. So that's things like collating data from all of your different sources, and that might be one source, there might be a couple of sources, but pulling that into an Excel spreadsheet. And then we go through the process of cleaning the data and also tokenizing or breaking apart the data. So trying to actually break it down, segment it into things that are actually kind of understandable and workable, but things that are going to actually kind of help you on your journey to developing a draft. So the second stage, we think about sorting and arranging the data. So that's things like questions around, what is a community action plan project or a local place plan proposal or both? That can be really helpful, particularly if you don't necessarily have time to do both. It allows you to kind of group the data, work with what you do have time for, and always come back to the other set. Also, choosing a thematic framework is really helpful. We typically use the Place Standard framework, and Paul's going to talk about that a little bit later in the session if you haven't come across it. But also labelling by primary theme and sorting that. You can then go into things like assigning sub-themes, labelling secondary themes, and also merging and counting. But yeah, not trying to get too lost in the detail. But again, we're going to kind of actively kind of talk you through what we mean by all of those processes through the session. And then lastly, representing the data. So that's thinking about presenting a kind of clear table. So as depicted on this lovely kind of diagram on the left-hand side, it's gone from kind of like a sort of chaos to an organized chaos to then actually something that's visually legible and really kind of telling the story with maps and text to kind of build the picture and the narrative of what the data is telling us. So next slide, thanks, Paul. And so this process, it can be quite overwhelming. To some people, it can be quite dull and time consuming, but really this is a really important kind of process around thinking at how we can deeply listen to the data. So really thinking about what is it that we are kind of hearing and seeing through the trends that are coming out. And also it's a really important kind of responsibility for the steering group to think about that as like quite a sacred duty, like it is a responsibility to kind of honour that and not bring bias to it. So again, we'll think about hints and tips for how we might approach that through the session. Next slide, thanks, Paul. But also it's, we're seeing the place through the eyes of others, and that can be like really fascinating in terms of some of the stuff that comes up. But I think it's also important to maybe recognise as well, this is where kind of understanding the skill sets of like your steering group or the team that's involved in the place plan can be really helpful, because for some people they really love getting into this stuff, and for others it's just like it's not their bag. So if you can find the people that exist who love the stuff, then great, and like delegate to them, because it is totally worth its weight in gold. And we've been fortunate to work in quite a few circumstances with groups who actually they have someone whose either background this is, or just like they're super interested in how to kind of code everything. So if you can, it's definitely worth asking that question, and that's why we try and encourage groups when they're starting these processes at the outset, really get to understand and know what each other's kind of skills and passions are, because down the line and in the journey that can become really helpful in terms of sort of breaking down the workload. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So I'll pass over to you to go through all of the different steps in more detail.
Thanks, Chiara. That's a brilliant introduction. Really appreciate that. So we're going to come to the first stage that Chiara outlined earlier, so collation. And as she mentioned, collating the data is about getting everything together from all the different places you've gathered it from. So that could be notes that you've taken in group sessions around a table. You might have had 6 tables in a public session, let's say, and someone in each group was writing down all the information that came in from the questions. Or you might be getting it from an online survey where you've run a Google form or a place check, which is a type of survey that I showed you last week. And you started from the basis of an exported spreadsheet. Or it could have been from individual interviews that you've done down the pub. So there could be lots of different places where you might have gathered information, both in physical and digital formats. So we need to get that all together in one place. And we need to clean the data. What do we mean by that? Well, depending on who's typed it in or what's been said, there is a stage where we need to figure out whether we understand exactly what's been said, whether things have been spelt wrongly or rightly, and sort through the data just to make it legible and readable and understandable. And then it can be the case also that we need to do what's called tokenization. That's the technical term for it. But I call it breaking apart the data. So sometimes people just give you a really long comment in answer to a question, and it meanders a bit and it goes into lots of different themes and says lots of different things. And so it's really difficult to assign a theme to it. So we break it down into several different statements. Okay, so example data sources. Here's someone's actually digitized. So this is a big job if you've done handwritten notes, is just typing them up. So we do recommend using Excel, mostly or a similar spreadsheet like Google Sheets, mostly because it's readily accessible. A lot of us are familiar with it. It can be a bit more time consuming. There are other ways to do it, but a lot of us are so familiar with these programs, that it's just the way that we go, to be honest. So we've digitized some written notes into a Word document, or maybe, for example, we've gone to place check, and I'll show you in a minute the export that will come out of a place check. But essentially what we need to do is digitize all the data if we need to, and then bring it all together in a long list of comments. So if you've gone through place check, once you've completed your place check, you can ask the company to put out an export spreadsheet, and it might come out looking a bit like this. Or indeed, you may have used a Google form, and again, you get a spreadsheet print out at the back end like this. So you've got several columns of data. If you've gone for a place check, you'll even have the longitude and latitude of the location that someone's dropped the pin in. So that can be really helpful because, as I showed you last time, you can literally just cut and paste those two pieces of information into Google Maps, and it will give you a pin exactly where that comment was located. However, moving back, essentially what we need to do is create a big long list of those responses. So you could take that sheet that I've just shown you and then add in all the data that's been typed up at other places. And then, as I say, create just a big long list on one sheet of paper. The next thing we need to do is tokenize it. So we need to break down the data. So I talk about the difference between a comment and a statement. A long comment that says lots of different things, breaking them down into individual statements. So what does that actually look like? So coming back to this spreadsheet, here what I've done is I've created a long list of comments from some data we took in from another survey that we did. So it wouldn't be uncommon to get a few hundred, 300-400 comments, all separate. This is the bit that can look a bit daunting. Like, what do we actually do with that? How do we make sure that we can get a grasp of it and get our heads around it enough? So here's the long list of responses, but then the first thing we need to do is tokenize them. So what do I mean by that? Well, we go through them and make sure that each comment is actually just saying one thing that makes sense in terms of the coding or themes that we might be using. So I'll give you an example and I'll zoom in here. Take this comment here. So someone's written, establish a white yet to bowling club core path. And then they've gone on to say, we need a home for the elderly, not just big 4-bedroom expensive private mansions, full stop. And we need a youth club desperately. So this is a comment that would be very difficult to thematize or code. So literally what I would then do is create a new row, or two in this case, and I would copy or cut the bits of the comment that look like they're distinct, and I'd create new rows for these things. So these are all things that have been said by one person, but we don't necessarily need to understand who said them. What we need to do is understand the things that have been said. So now, from having a comment, we've got 3 different statements that are much easier to thematize. We know that this one here is talking about a walking route, this one here is talking about housing, and this one here is talking about a youth club. So that's tokenization. And then we also want to look out for this question of this task of cleaning the data. So take this comment here. So it's fine. It's only really saying one thing, which is that we need some more sports facilities. And I think I know where that should go. But the way it's been typed in, with the best will in the world, there's spelling mistakes and it just looks a bit odd. So obviously someone's typed a dollar symbol here instead of an I. So I changed that to an I. Sports facilities with a Z. Okay, I changed that to an S. So this is an example of cleaning the data, just to make sure that right at the beginning, the stuff's legible and easy to read and actually makes sense. So that's tokenization and cleaning the data. We can't show you, we've only got a limited amount of time, so we're just showing you some principles as the steps I would go through. So I'd go through and just do that pretty much for every comment. So that's going to take you a little bit of time. And we do recommend that you split up this task over several sessions rather than necessarily doing it one at a time. Or delegate, slopey shoulders. Okay, so that's basically collation. So we bring it all into one spreadsheet, we clean it, and we tokenize the data so that it's easy to work with. Next, I'm just going to close that for now. Go back to our presentation. And reshare. Next, what we have to do is thematize the data. So we've done everything we need to do in the basic first step. So now what we want to do is sort and arrange it. So we want to decide whether the idea is related to a community action plan, a project or an activity that is not necessarily related to the use and development of land and buildings controlled by the planning system, or whether what's being said could be developed into a local place plan proposal, which is relevant to the planning system and has to do with the use of land and buildings. Now, at this stage, we don't have to get this exactly perfect. And in truth, it's a bit of an artificial distinction because separating from people from place is artificial. But if we've got a limited amount of time and we're only wanting to create a local place plan and we're only wanting to create proposals that make sense to influence the local development plan, there's a really helpful stage to help break down the data that we actually work with or need to work with. And then what we need to do is choose a thematic framework, the place standard, before we start labeling the data. Okay, so how do we decide whether it's a community action plan or local place plan piece of data? So this is where we come back to what I talked about in the first session, difference between crabs and fishes. So obviously something that someone suggested could also be both. So look out for them if you're unsure. But basically, try your best to figure out which is which. And if necessary, you could run some of this stuff by a professional or a built environment professional, a planning officer, just to get a take on that. And remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, and you have to create a column to label this. But if you want to have a little sense of what could be a local place plan proposal and what could be a community action plan project, because you're going to get both. If you go to the Planning Aid Scotland guide for community delivered local place plans that I wrote, and when you get these slides, these are actually included in a link. You can download the overview of that guide. It's at the resources page. Maybe Chiara can just put a link in comments to paz.org.uk/resources, Chiara. And in there, in that first overview document, there's a page that lists out the things that could be classed as related to development and might be meaningful and those which likely aren't. And if you remember, we did a quiz in the first week where we started figuring the different things out. So go back to that episode if you want to learn a bit more about it. And then what we have is, so we need to have a set of categories to thematize our data to. So Chiara and I use the place standard for this. So why do we use that? It's very well known across Scotland. It was developed in Scotland. It's a set of structured questions around 14 different themes. Most themes are moving around, which is to do with active travel, walking, wheeling, and cycling. Public transport, that's buses and trains. Traffic and parking, that could be roads, could be living spaces. Streets and spaces are to do with the built environment and the public realm. Natural space is your woods, your forests, your lochs, etc. Play and recreation, that's more like green space, play parks. Facilities and services, these could be to do with the community buildings or health centres or the types of services that we expect the council to deliver us. Work and economy, self-explanatory. Housing and community, just to say, I just use that category for housing. Community and community interaction, I say for the next category, which is social interactions. So that's about the types of youth clubs, clubs for the elderly, how we gather, how we connect with one another. We've got identity and belonging, which is about how we feel connected to our place, the kind of things that make our place unique and special and make us feel like we belong. Feeling safe, that I think of that as usually things to do with lighting, with crime. Care and maintenance, that's everything to do with, park upkeep or litter picking, dog poo, etc. Potholes, influence and control. That's the last one. So that's all about consultation and like community council and how we work together as a community to influence stuff. Now, those are 14 categories. And in our experience, most of the things that will come back to you will slot neatly into one of those broad categories. Place standard is also great because it's very well known across the charity sector in Scotland, the local authority sector and the Scottish government sector. People who you produce this report for will recognise these categories and understand them very readily. So they're a good way to communicate what you want to say to other people in wider circles. We add one extra category at least, which is a category around climate, adaptation and mitigation. So dealing with the causes and the consequences of climate change. So that could be things like flood prevention, etc., etc. Now, climate should go through all of these 14 categories, but there are often ideas and projects and proposals that are specifically trying to address one of these issues. The idea of community wind, for example, would come onto that category. That's a little intro to the place standard themes. You can Google place standard. There's a lot of information out there. So those are the two things we now need to do. Think about whether it's a CAP or an LPP thing and what category, what primary category, according to the place standard, we want to code against. So let's give that a bash. So coming back to our working sheet here, here's some examples. So water security. This is a weird one, by the way. Someone wrote this, water security. This is a popular walking route and makes it safer and more user-friendly, would enhance community green spaces. So for me, just referring backwards, this is something that I would clean up. So I don't know exactly what this person was intending by water security, but I think basically, as the best of my knowledge, what they're talking about is a walking route along the river. So I'm just going to assume that that's what it is, because I've got no way of going back to this anonymous person. So that might sound like, whoa, you've just deleted some data. Well, ultimately, we can only code what we understand. So would that be a CAP or an LPP thing or both? Well, if we want to build the path and set up a charity to do it, it'd be for a CAP. So we want to set up a charity, but usually that active travel routes, I would think of that as an LPP thing. Next one. Here's one. I missed the gender of the floppy duck. I just randomly made that up for this session. This makes no sense. I would clean this and just delete it. Like, it just makes no sense. I don't know what to do with it. I'm not going to do anything with it. Sorry. Whatever's happened there, I can't help. Next one. So it's a core path. So this is the one that we tokenize, one of the ones we tokenize. So that's a core path. That's laying out an active travel route idea is definitely for the LPP. Housing is LPP thing. And a youth club, though, setting up a youth club, it's got not really anything to do with planning system. So that's probably a CAP thing. More sports facilities. Well, if it's to allocate land for that, that's an LPP. But if we want to build something, or maybe that's a CAP thing. So that could be both. Path could be better maintained. Now, maintenance is a CAP thing because it's not about designing or implementing a path. It's about upkeep. Clack and burn. In heavy rain, you will see a storm drain empty into the burn, flood protection, right? So that is probably an LPP thing. Okay, so we've done a few. That's an example of what I would do. And then you can sort. You could sort through. If you only want to look at the LPP stuff, you can obviously then just choose LPP as a category and just focus on those. Next, we will need to assign a primary theme. And for this, Chiara and I use the place standard. So what place standard theme would the first one be? Well, I think that's moving around. It's to do with active travel. And the next one is a core path thing as well. So that's moving around too. But now that we've broken them apart, I would say that the next one is housing. So I'd use the place standard theme of housing there. Next one is a youth club. So I would call that social interaction. Now, you guys might interpret the place standard themes differently to me, and that's okay. The key thing is, what do we come back to? Consistency. As long as you consistently tag the same thing the same way, it's okay to assign a different primary theme to something than I would, as long as you guys know what you're talking about and why you've put it that way. Sports facilities, right? Place standard category, that's facilities and services. Clack and burn. There isn't a place standard category for climate adaptation, so I create one. So I've just added climate adaptation as a primary theme. So you get the sense of what you can do there. Here's a common one, dog poo. Well, that's community action plan. The planning system has no control over dog poo, but you might want to advocate with other council departments about that. And then the primary theme I would assign to that is care and maintenance. Sorry, wrong one. Wrong category. So I would assign that as care and maintenance. So you can see where we're going here. Here's another one I would just delete. If you get any rude comments, such as kill all the bloody kids making a racket at all hours outside my house, you either change that and recognize that someone's trying to say something meaningful, which is about feeling safe, or if it's just really rude, delete it. Another one that I've had before is remove as many of the rich folks who've come in from the outside as possible. I just delete that. That's cleaning the data. That's me. You might do it differently. Okay, so we've now decided whether it's an LPP or CAP. We've also assigned a place standard theme. And of course, then we can sort according to our place standard themes. So we could just choose care and maintenance, climate adaptation. So immediately we're starting to figure out roughly which statements are linked to which theme. And eventually you'll be able to order them all by theme and have all the statements that are similar together. At which point it becomes easy to do what I call adding a sub-theme. Now, you don't necessarily have to go to this granularity or detail, but often what you'll do with over 300 or 400 comments, you might have 50 comments about moving around, and they're all saying different things. So they might be saying something about a walking path, they might be saying about something about cycling infrastructure, or they might be saying something about accessibility for the disabled. So adding a sub-theme can help you sift the data that one greater level. So for example, I would put this first one under the idea of a new route of a sub-theme. Housing for the elderly, I would maybe put that under affordable housing. Facilities and services for a sports field, I would maybe put that under sports. So what you're building up is a picture of, with different levels of granularity, you're assigning and labeling a primary theme and then a sub-theme to your comments. Well, how does that help? In the end, once you've done all of that and you've made a couple of color changes, here's what you can end up with. So you can have a whole host of, you've extracted all the LPP comment statements. You've assigned all of them, whether a primary theme, if they're here, in this case, it's facilities and services. You've assigned all of them a sub-theme, and then you can then sort on both of those topics, and then you can count how many people have basically said the same thing to give you a sense of the strength of what's happened. And you can even keep some of the data. If there's some specific data you don't want to lose, because if you count all the same things, what I do is I just delete all the comments that are basically saying the same thing. But if there's some detail, I keep it to one side. And so then what you get ultimately is a spreadsheet where you've got a sense of the weighting of each comment, and you're able to see very clearly what things people are talking about in different ways. Now that is the basis for having a good conversation as a steering group as to what proposals you could think about for your process. That was a very quick run through how I do stuff. And there's more that could be said. We don't have too much time. That will probably come out in the questions. But what I've tried to do to summarize is break it up into CAP and LPP ideas, assign a primary theme according to the place standard, make it more granular by bringing all the stuff together that's basically saying the same stuff within each theme. And then you can merge the comments. You can see really clearly that these 10 comments are talking about basically the same thing. You merge them and give a count next to them. So you're breaking down the data into manageable chunks and you're coming up with a framework. So coming to an end with my bit of the show. Okay, once you've done that, you'll notice that certain place standard themes lend themselves to local place plan proposals. So I would say that often, if you categorize according to the place standard themes of moving around, traffic and parking, streets and spaces, natural spaces, play and recreation, facilities and services, and housing are often going to have stuff in them that have to do with the use and development of land or buildings controlled by the planning system. Not always. Potholes and adding speed bumps are not really controlled by the planning system unless it's to do with new development. That would come under traffic and parking, but new parking areas would do. Whereas things where people are saying stuff about where we need better timetables for our buses or lower fares, which is often what people say in public transport, is more of a CAP thing where you have to advocate with private companies or the council. Social interaction is often about setting up groups and events that you can just do anyway. You don't really need to talk to the planning system about that. Identity and belonging is often about more ephemeral but still important things like culture and identity. Feeling safe might have some planning stuff. Crime isn't really to do with planning, but lighting for a park or a pathway, yeah, could go. Care and maintenance is almost always for the CAP. Planning has very little to say about care and maintenance of places. Influence and sense of control, so that's about collaboration, how we connect in the community to make political change. It's often a CAP thing. That's just a general observation. So how does this all fit in? So once you created that spreadsheet, we've analysed the data we've got from the engagement. Then we can go on and use that as the basis for starting to work up proposals and develop our first draft. So that's where we go to stage 4. And if you're watching this video, you would then go back to our third video on project management, zoom forward and just pick up the thread at stage 4 at that point and see what to do with your coded data. Later in the process, so after you've developed your draft, you would then want to represent your data. So you could present it as a table or show it as a map with a story. And very simply, you could show for a CAP, you've got all the data in a spreadsheet. It then becomes a formatting issue to shape up that data into columns and rows that you can literally then just cut and paste into a Word document, plonk, and have a clear table that you can use to show information in your community action plan or local place plan. Whereas for an LPP, You've then got the basic data to start working up a proposal and start drawing a map of the area that you're going to talk about. And ultimately, remember what we're doing when we create a local place plan report is we're trying to tell a story about a compelling story about the future of our place to convince the planners and to inspire our community. And so it's really good to take your data and try and create imagery, take some photos to represent it in a compelling way. Okay, you've heard enough from me. Back to you, Chiara.
Great, thanks, Paul. So we're now just going to close the session with some final pointers. So next slide, thanks. The first one is the question of how much is a good return? And generally, we kind of adopt the approach of if your work or survey face-to-face engagement kind of generates 10% respondents in your community, then that is pretty good. And also, I think it's always coming back to that phrase and the mantra of you can only do like your best with the resources you have. But generally, we use that as a sort of indication of what's good. And if you dramatically exceed that, then absolutely fantastic. But yeah, we tend to use that as a sort of kind of like baseline. Next slide, thanks. The other thing to kind of observe is, more data isn't necessarily better data. And I think it's about finding that right balance between like the ability to get the data and your capacity to process it as well, because it can also take, a fairly long period of time if you've got like hundreds and hundreds of comments, and that's obviously going to scale depending on the size of your place as well. But also to kind of note that past a certain point, additional data is often just adds to the mandate rather than the insight. So it's kind of about trying to find that balance, and that's why I think we try and use like a framework to help code the data so it actually turns it into something manageable that we can break down and kind of comprehend without kind of losing the will, for want of a better term. Next slide, thanks. And then just a few things to consider. I think when we're dealing with data, it's also important to think about the management of that. So as a group, considering the ownership and storage location of the data, i.e. is there one shared source of information? Ensuring that the data set is the correct version, so being quite methodical with version control as well, particularly when you're going through quite a kind of robust logical kind of process. You don't want that to be interrupted by someone kind of using the wrong version, or making sure, especially if you're operating in the sort of team environment to do this, that people have the most latest version, or you are working in that shared space which kind of live updates. And then that last question around, is there a shared Google Drive or equivalent that you can use to kind of, as I say, live time, so you don't have to deal with so much version control, and there's ways to kind of recall information. And as I say, that's a topic that can be expanded at another time, but something just to kind of flag to think about. And then in terms of the analysis side, it can help to do it in small batches. I think that's probably fairly obvious, but important to remember. I don't think it helps to do it in a sort of marathon setting, because you kind of need to come to it quite fresh. Also, if you're not sure what a statement's trying to say, it can really help to kind of buddy up and discuss in a group or a pair. So even just like highlighting something to come back to, that can be really useful. When selecting categories, just make your best judgment based on the comment or statement. The key thing being is it can be refined at a later stage. So it might well be there's instances where we've worked with groups where one person's done the first pass and then a second person's kind of almost done a checking role. So again, it tries to kind of keep it quite fast paced and not too laboured in terms of doing that. It's also really useful for subsequent stages to know the data well. So the long route kind of does mean and lead to a really good understanding, which then helps kind of shape the narrative, particularly as you're beginning to then draft the proposals. And also to trust the process and don't be tempted to make assumptions. Like that is really key when we come back to thinking about this analysis process as quite a kind of sacred and trusted process. And also, it's important to also recognise older reports. So also thinking about, how can the data be included from like conversations, and it's not just newly coded data. And also if you find like a really kind of good quote or statement, put it to one side, because that can be really useful in terms of, adding that narrative and the storytelling aspect, and you can include it in a sort of call out in the final report as well. Next slide, thank you. And yeah, finally, kind of just to bring us back to those core principles as a bit of a reminder. So those kind of 3 key things: consistency, honesty, transparency. And as we've touched on tonight, that's one method of analysis. There's many other ways you can code data out there. But I think whatever approach you do take, if you kind of do the above, you can't go too far wrong. Next slide, thank you. And I think that brings us to a close. So we've got some time for some questions, which I think there's quite a few coming through the chat. So maybe stop sharing.